on a book about scaling up climate solutions. Akshat has a PhD in organic chemistry from Oxford, and he's also worked for The Economist and the Royal Society of Chemistry. Also on stage, to find out where this optimism is coming from, is Dame Frances Cairncross. She's an eminent economist, journalist, and academic. She's a senior fellow at the School of Public Policy, UCLA, and she's formerly chaired the executive committee of the Institute of Fiscal Studies and was the rector of Exeter College, Oxford. Ladies and gentlemen, please give a very warm welcome to Akshat, Rathi and Dame Frances Cairncross.
Well, I think I'm going to grab the right to start because I found Akshat, as it were. He did an undergraduate degree in chemistry in Mumbai and then came on a graduate course to do a DPhil at Exeter College, where I happened to be the head of the college. And he did a lot to make the college thrive, but he eventually said he wanted to go and take up a post on The Economist, a temporary student post for, I think, a few months. How should he do it? And I gave him some ideas, and lo and behold, he got his post on The Economist, where he started off as a journalist. And he's now, as you've heard, a senior climate reporter for Bloomberg News, and has written, this is your second book, I think.
Yeah, so I should say Frances edited my first piece of journalism, and now she gets to interview me about my first book. So this is the first book I've written. There's a book called United We Are Unstoppable, which I edited, which is essays from 60 climate activists from around the world. But this is the first book I've written, so it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for doing this.
Well, your background is in technology. Was this a book that you wanted to write because you felt the technologies available were being misused or misinterpreted? Or was there some broader reason for wanting to produce this book?
So, I mean, for context, Frances also was an environment journalist for a long time. In 1991, she published a book called Costing the Earth, the opportunities for business and the challenges for government. And climate change is not a new topic. We've been talking about it for a very long time. I started out as a science journalist. That's some of the pieces that you edited for me. But environment at the time, as I looked at the subject, only read of dire news headlines. But then something shifted after 2015 when the Paris Agreement was signed. And that's when Donald Trump got elected, and he started talking about clean coal. So even as somebody who didn't believe in climate change, he felt compelled to talk about climate solutions. Now, clean coal is a marketing phrase, but there is a technology underlying that, and that's where I started looking, because my background helped me sort of sift through what is real and what's not. But as I started writing the book, and it's been 4 years since I pitched the book, and now it'll be out in October this year, what I found is, as much as technology is underappreciated, there are all these other forces that are needed to make sure that the potential of technology to solve this problem can become real, and that's what really the book is about. It's about how people, policy, and technology can come together to really tackle the solution, and that there are people already doing it.
What makes it an easy book to read, I think, is that you divide it into these chapters about the various parts that people play, people with different roles, different skills, and different technologies, different approaches. And that gives one a sense of focusing on each of these in turn. Tell us which of them, of those little profiles, was your favorite one to write, and why?
So the favorite one was a profile of a science minister in China. Now, having looked at his story, he is really the Elon Musk you should know. But you may not know him because he doesn't have a social media presence and is not a billionaire. But he is the force behind making electric cars a reality. Even though we think about Tesla as the company that sort of popularized electric cars in the West, really it is China where most of the critical minerals for batteries are built, most of the batteries are built, most of the electric cars are built, and most of the electric cars are sold. And that period of building that industry out between 2009 and 2019, which is the 10 years where he was science minister, really created the momentum for the entire industry to shift. Because in China, all your automakers are partnering with global automakers. And for global automakers, the market to sell cars is China. So if you're working in China and you have to sell electric cars, you have to shift your entire production toward electrification. And being able to tell his story felt like a real joy, because it's sort of an unsung hero in the climate solution space.
And you visited China, you interviewed him, you talked, you saw what he was doing.
Yes.
What really struck you there, apart from talking to this remarkable and unsung hero?
Well, so I grew up in India, moved to the UK to do my grad school at Exeter and in Oxford. So that was sort of going from a developing country to a developed country. But when I went to China, what struck me most was it felt like the more developed country in the world. Infrastructurally, everything worked, and it worked marvelously. Looking at just the sheer interest and entrepreneurship on electrification, both in batteries and cars, so we think about China as a state-directed economy, which it is, but we don't think about what state-directed entrepreneurialism can look like, and being able to see it on the ground was quite the experience.
I mean, China is still the major contributor to...
It is. It is the largest greenhouse gas emitter, and it is the largest investor in green technologies. And this sort of two-track world that we live in, where the largest emitter is also the largest investor in green technologies, is also sort of, we are in this place where we are reading really terrible headlines around the world. You know, in Italy there were floods, something like 21 rivers or rivulets were flooding. F1, which, so greenhouse gases, had to be cancelled because of it. Those headlines are only going to keep getting worse. So that's one track world. But the other track is climate solutions are growing and growing at scale. And we're just going to have to learn to grapple this sort of two-track world that we are going to live in for quite some time as we deal with climate change.
Well, now, one of the other bigger emitters, of course, is India, your home country. And I really enjoyed your description of your attempts with your father, an engineer, to join up solar power to the local network. Can you just tell us a little bit about that? It's such a good story.
So the chapter on India in the book is about scaling solar power. Now, solar power, nothing that is alien to anybody now. You see them on rooftops around the world. But India really has the potential to scale solar more than most other countries, given just its geography, where it is, how much sun it gets. But it's one thing to have a technology that's cheap, and quite another to make sure that it reaches all the people that it must. And doing that, just trying to get solar for my parents' rooftop in Nasik, my hometown, was an experience. We were able to find somebody to sell it and install it within a week, but to get permitting from the state electricity board, to get the right cabling from the state electricity board to the house, took 5 months. So that's the sort of challenge that we are going to face, not just in India, but across the world, as we try and put in place the solutions that we do have are cheaper than the alternatives, but need to get people to skill up, need to get government and bureaucrats to understand its real potential, and help those solutions become as important as they need to be.
Tell us a little bit more, since this is an Indian event, where you think India goes on all of this. Is this something that the government actually grasps? Do you think that ministers understand it? Do you think that there is really the energy behind making a change that one would want to see?
So one thing that is very apt and everybody will recognize immediately is India is a very price-sensitive market, and it has to be. It's still a low to middle income developing country. There's a lot of poverty still around. And people will only buy things if it really makes economic sense. And so one thing that the Indian government has been able to grasp, and this is not just the current regime under Prime Minister Modi, but even Prime Minister Manmohan Singh and the Congress party, was that for India, energy efficiency, which is being able to do more with less energy, is the quickest, easiest, simplest, cheapest way to do stuff. And so India's had a massive success in the rollout of LEDs, light-emitting diodes, and pretty much every light now we see, maybe not these ones, are not LED, are LED. And in India, the rollout has been the fastest at scale around the world, because you're going from a 100-watt incandescent bulb to a 5-watt LED. You're saving 95% of your electricity. And so that was one. The other one where India saw an opportunity is to then use that sort of energy efficiency and apply it to industry. So over here in Europe, also in the UK, now that the UK has left the European Union, there is a carbon price, and that comes through something called a cap and trade system, where you tell industry to limit their emissions to a certain level, and then that limit keeps falling. And if they limit it below that, they can trade those emissions and make money. If they're above that cap, they have to pay a price. In India, they applied that to energy efficiency. So they have a cap and trade system to get industry to become more energy efficient, similar in a similar way. And finally, now that Europe, which has been the continent where most climate action has happened, has come out with a carbon tariff. So they will, on goods that are coming into Europe, apply a carbon price if the emissions on those goods are higher than the emissions of goods produced in Europe. That's going to mean India exporting goods to Europe will become more expensive. So India is tackling that by introducing a carbon price, or it's talking about introducing a carbon price. So there's already this momentum internally on solutions that can be scaled, and because of international pressures, other solutions are being looked at.
But the solution of a more efficient electricity grid clearly does not yet exist, is that right? Is anything happening on that front that will make it easier for you and your father to connect up in future years?
Yes, so I mean, as much as rooftop solar is a problem that India needs to deal with, most of India's solar solution will be what is called utility scale. So these are just large lands that you connect up to solar panels. And for that, some of the solutions are being worked on. So in India, the utilities are indebted. They are because either electricity is stolen or there are not enough people paying it. But if you want utility scale solar, you need a system where they will get payment for the services they provide. And so what the Indian government has done is build a federal solar body that can help those utilities build those solar plants and not rely on the indebted state utilities to scale up the solution. So there are workarounds being developed, but if India really wants to grasp its potential, the states have to play a part, and that's something that needs to be worked on.
Well, tell me a little bit about Europe now, particularly wind power. I have a house in Galloway, and I look out of the window to a great row of windmills in the Solway Firth. But Denmark clearly found its way to wind in a particularly interesting way, which you describe in the book. Would you like to tell us something about that?
So one thing that people might have heard of, or if they haven't, is a company called Ørsted, which is a big giant wind power company. And it used to be Dong Energy before, which stood for Danish Oil and Natural Gas. And in a 10-year period, it went from being an oil and gas company to being a wind power giant. It now is the majority market in offshore wind. That has become a business case study. You go to get an MBA if you're interested in sustainability, it's going to be talked about. And surely in that 10-year period, it is a business case study. But how it got to that point is actually a government-driven policy trial and error. And for Denmark, that began all the way back in the 1970s, where the oil crisis caused Denmark among all European nations, a particular stress. And so it needed to move away from imported energy very quickly. And that's when it created the Danish oil and natural gas company to try and take whatever little oil and gas was available in the North Sea. But in the 90s, they had a prime minister who was very interested and was recognizing the climate challenge. You know, this is the time when Margaret Thatcher spoke about it, Indira Gandhi spoke about it. There was a real momentum. You know, George H.W. Bush on the Republican side in the US spoke about it. And so there was a real momentum to try and do something. And he said that we'll give you permits to build coal power plants, which are the power plants that were being built at the time, because you could import coal from non-Middle Eastern countries. And he said, you can only build them if you also build offshore wind, which is a technology, we don't know if it works, but you should invest more money in it. And that accident of being the first country to experiment with it is what Ørsted eventually was able to grab and turn into an entire industry and become a global leader.
Well, you talk about that memorable period when there was some enthusiasm among global leaders for doing something about climate change. Since then, I think the mood has changed and the enthusiasm among politicians has diminished. Is that something that worries you? Do you think the pressures are going to have to come entirely from well-meaning companies or from inspired individuals or even from activists who protest about these things?
It's, I mean, you know, following your book, which came out around that period where people were so interested, there was a very strong and directed campaign, which I chronicle in the book, where oil companies funded disinformation campaign over the 90s to try and sow doubt about climate science. That had to be overcome in the 2000s. And really the momentum, climate momentum among global leaders has waxed and waned through the decades, but there was a particular lull during the 90s because of that disinformation campaign. Now, in the 2010s onwards, climate denialism still exists, but it's not one that most government leaders are listening to. Even Donald Trump, you know, the man who doesn't think climate change is real, had to kowtow to climate solutions because it's one now where businesses realize if you don't address the problem in the future and in the short term, both sides are they're going to suffer one way or another. So both sides of the political spectrum now are under the pressure. But you're right. I mean, it waxes because after what happened in Russia and Russia invading Ukraine, the European Union, which has been a climate champion, has had to rethink how it's going to get its energy. And if it's not going to import that fuel from Russia, it'll have to import it from somewhere else in the short term. And that's allowed it to slow down some of the investments that it was making. You know, on the weekend, yesterday, the G7 communique came out, and there's line about allowing for some limited investments in gas, which didn't exist last year. So there's sort of a step back. So we are in a world where finally it's 2 steps forward, 1 step backward, rather than 2 steps backward and 1 step forward.
You don't talk much about nuclear power in your book.
Yes.
Should you have said more? It's an obvious choice, which Germany has turned its back on, for example.
Yes, so the goal of the book was to try and look at history and the future. So I was at that inflection point of being able to write from a moment in time. The history of nuclear power is one of clear success. If we no longer true as of 2023, but until 2022, the largest source of clean electricity in the world was nuclear. Now it's wind and solar combined. But the trouble is, from a future perspective, nuclear doesn't appear to be as big a part of the solution mix as we would have expected it to be. And there are a number of reasons why. One is the nuclear industry is correctly, and this is, you can talk about it and criticize it, but is over-regulated because of the heavy amount of risk that may come from nuclear meltdowns. there is obviously fear around it, and so that over-regulation comes from people wanting more regulation. And so that's caused it to really increase the price at which you can build new nuclear power plants. They are now frequently overrun in cost. They are frequently delayed by years, and we're not talking 2 years, 5 years, sometimes decades. And that causes it to become a concern from a way of trying to solve the climate problem in a time-limited manner. However, there are some innovations happening around small nuclear reactors. If those take off in the next 5 years, and if I ever write another book, maybe they become a bigger part of the solution. But currently, it doesn't appear to be a solution that has the momentum to really deliver.
Well, in a moment, I want to start asking people for questions. In fact, here is a question coming up straight away. So why don't we just take your question, sir?
This is a fascinating conversation. I thank you both so much. I recently participated in a conference on corporate social responsibility, and I was very disappointed with the absence of any reference to technology. And I was wondering if you could perhaps speak about where CSR and technology are coming together today.
It's interesting. Are you sure they use the term corporate social responsibility?
Yes.
Wow. I write. Yeah. So these days, it's mostly sustainability or net zero planning or offset. So CSR.
Why don't you talk a bit about your chapter on Unilever, which
Yes.
is really remarkable.
So there's I do have a chapter looking at exactly that issue of what corporations are doing dealing with the climate problem, and it's a mixed picture, as you can imagine, but mixed in a good way, which is that they are finally doing some real things rather than just making noises about it. So the chapter is about Unilever, which is a giant company. You've all either, if you don't know about it, you've 100% used their products, everything from toothpaste to oatmeal to whatnot. They are one of those companies which had the foresight of thinking about climate risks as a risk to their business, which is a really good example was 2 years ago there was a heat wave in the Pacific Northwest, one of the most extreme heat waves where in northern Canada you had 50 degrees Celsius temperature in a town causing wildfires. Usually in a heat wave, Unilever profits because people go out and buy more ice cream. But in an extreme heat wave, ice cream sales go down. And that's a real problem for Unilever, which it has had to understand through climate modeling and through understanding how climate risks will play out over the next few decades. So it got down addressing climate as both a risk to its business, but also a challenge for the world early in its life. And that's allowed it to gain a much better market share in products that now people are buying as they are becoming more conscious about climate change. The other end of the spectrum is ExxonMobil, which is a giant oil company, very famous for not really doing anything about climate change. But over the past 2 years, 3 years, it's been forced by its own shareholders to address the problem. So if you as a company are not forward-thinking and do something about the problem, we are at that moment where there's enough government policy, enough public pressure that shareholders will come around and force you to act instead. Because people are not able to get out. There are warnings from government. Your shops are shut. There are no Deliveroos available. It's sort of an extreme weather event where you have wildfires, and you'd expect that to be the case where extreme weather events happen.
Sir.
A very simple question. Something which you read a little bit about in the press, and certainly has a lot of scientists excited, and perhaps the government as well, and that is nuclear fusion. Mm-hmm. And there is quite a lot of government interest and investment, but nuclear fusion doesn't exist. I'd be really interested in your perspective, whether you think nuclear fusion is still an interesting research project or a real credible part of the solution.
Yeah, it's a good question. And there is a chapter in the book looking at exactly that, which is future technologies and what should be backed and what should not. Now, nuclear fusion, irrespective of whether we are thinking about the climate problem or not, is a technology that is worthy of having for humanity. So nuclear fusion is where you take hydrogen and you compress it and you make helium. In the process of compressing it, you produce energy. So you're doing the reverse of what nuclear fission does, where you take a molecule of uranium, split it into smaller atoms and produce energy. In nuclear fusion, you don't have very much radiation. You have a source of fuel that's unlimited, but, really to the level that it can there can be anything unlimited on this finite planet. And you have the ability to be able to do it both at small and large scale. So nuclear fusion is a technology that should be worked on regardless of climate problems. And it is something, that's why one reason why governments invest in it. What has been interesting for me watching it is that there's a lot of private money now going into nuclear fusion, because there are some people who are making bets that you might be able to see a nuclear fusion demonstration within the next decade. And that to me is still unbelievable from looking at how much money is going. It's very interesting to look at, but I don't think we can bet on nuclear fusion as a climate solution. So it's a technology that's worthy of pursuit, but at this moment it doesn't feel like it's a climate solution. It's the same problem with nuclear fission.
This is the advantage of having someone with an Oxford doctorate in chemistry. Up there, yes.
Yes, I wonder if you can comment on a very complex situation. First of all, we have lots of campaigners saying to us, we've got to keep all fossil fuels in the ground, because once you burn anything, the carbon dioxide stays up there for something like 300 to 1,000 years.
Correct.
And the other thing is that we all know that in this climate of high prices and so on, that once we do get renewables in place, the public will get the cheapest energy historically.
Yeah.
And yet we seem to be dragging our feet in putting renewables into place as fast as possible, with companies and so on wanting to burn every gram of fossil fuel so that they can squeeze all the money out of it before the renewables arrive. Can you sort of comment on what are the trends that could take us towards the ideal situation?
Yeah, it's a very good question, and one that feels more pertinent now than it did 10 years ago, where if somebody's asked that question, they would say, well, but renewables are more expensive. That's not true anymore. Now that renewables are cheaper than fossil fuels, the question is really, why is it taking so long? And the answer is different in different parts of the world, but also within countries, it's different in different regions. And it's, if there is a way to generalize it, one is its inertia, that people know what they know, which is how to burn fossil fuels and generate energy. Yes, renewables, when they are available, are intermittent, right? Sun comes for a while and the wind's not always available. So it feels like it's not a one-to-one replacement to fossil fuels. And that is one especially from a perspective of the grid, is something that is very conservative. We don't usually think about it this way, but the grid is really a network of pipes without a tank, which is to say, if you open your tank, somebody has to pump water right away. So somebody has to generate that electron at that moment so that you can consume it. And so it's a very finely balanced act to be able to run an electric grid. And so the people who run them are very conservative in what they want on the grid and how they're going to manage. So they have to be pushed to try and bring more green energy onto the grid. And alongside the intermittency of renewables, they have to be provided with storage solutions, so batteries of some kind. And those are expensive still. So even though solar and wind have become cheaper, batteries still are expensive. So it's not quite there yet to be able to be the only source of energy that you should be deploying. However, globally, 70% of new electricity that was installed last year was renewables. So we've already shifted our mix that we are building out. It needs to be much more and faster, and that's where government policy has to come in to help.
Hang on a second. Wait a moment. Let me just get let's just get the microphone to you, if I might. And then I want to hear from you up there.
Is there any country responsible for this big shift to 70% renewables?
A lot of the countries today, actually, Denmark, for example, can generate on days 100% of its electricity as it's being used through wind. The EU as a whole, in the first quarter of this year, generated more electricity from solar and wind than it did from gas and coal. And so it's already there in many parts of the world. But it's really countries like India where renewables need to play a much bigger role, and that's going to take some time.
You had mentioned...
Just a minute. If you'll excuse me, I'll just call this gentleman here, because it's a long way from Bobby to scoot up there and back again. So please go ahead.
Yeah, you mentioned clean coal. Now, in India, as you know, there's lots of coal and it's very poor quality coal. And India's still going ahead and using coal a great deal. What exactly do you mean by clean coal?
Yes. So clean coal is a marketing phrase. What really is the technology is called carbon capture, where you capture the carbon dioxide after the coal is burned and then sequester it underground rather than putting it into the atmosphere where it's going to warm the planet. The trouble with it is it's expensive. So if you have to do the step of taking the carbon dioxide and then burying it underground, it's expensive. So clean coal was a way of saying you could still continue to burn coal, but have carbon capture technology alongside it. What's happened since, clean coal is kind of not being pursued to that level anymore is because clean electricity is cheaper. So it's much easier to just build out wind and solar and some batteries rather than build out coal. The place where carbon capture as a technology might be end up used is in cement factories, which whether you use coal or not, produce carbon dioxide just from the chemistry of the cement. And so those are the places where you cannot get rid of the carbon dioxide, and so you must use a technology that would capture it. But clean coal has the other side, which India still needs to do more work on, which is non-carbon dioxide, non-climate related. So this is particulate emissions. We know of all the smog that's there in Indian cities. It's sulfur dioxide emissions. It's hydrogen sulfide emissions. These are really toxic and they kill people. Like air pollution is 7 million deaths today. Air pollution, that's got nothing to do with climate directly. But that is something India really needs to do more on, and the government is dragging its feet, especially over the last 5 years. Every time the cleaner burning standards are to be applied, they delay them because the industry wants to keep burning them with all the pollutants going out because it's cheaper to do so.
Now, I was intending your neighbour here to use it, but maybe you would like to use it first and then pass it down the line.
I'd be very interested to know what your view on bankers are in this game, because I'm an ex-banker and we're always told we're very bad boys. So if you could let us know as to how effective the banking system really is in terms of identifying companies that do things or put pressure on those companies not to do things.
Well, one thing it might tell you is I am a climate reporter at Bloomberg News, which is one of the bankers' favorite tool. And it was only 2020 that Bloomberg launched a climate vertical. So there's clearly interest from bankers to want to read climate news. So that's a good thing. But you're right. If any of what we talked about has to happen, as much as government and technology have to play a part, private capital has to come through, and that will come through the finance world writ large. The finance world is really grappling with how it can be a part of the solution. And it's not quite in the phase that the oil and gas industry is, which is it's not that its entire business model is dependent on fuels that will worsen the climate problem, but a good chunk of its profits still come from the fossil fuel industry. And so it needs to understand how it's going to use its own heft and power to actually shift the momentum. And in some places that's already happening. So there's a large organization called the Global Financial Alliance for Net Zero. It's called GFANZ. That was started by Mark Carney, who's a former Bank of England governor. And that's bringing in all these $100 trillion worth of asset managers under one umbrella to figure out how to finance the right things and not finance the wrong things. But it's slow moving still. The ratio of many of the banks funding fossil fuels versus funding clean energy still tends to be lower than 1 to 1, which is not where you need to be now.
Now, can you, but before I come to you, could you just pass it along to your neighbour, please? Thank you.
I didn't actually have another question. I have 100 things I'd like to ask, but I feel like I've had my chance.
No, go ahead. And since it's taken a while for you to get the microphone, why don't you
It seems to me
advantage?
that there one of the shifts that's happening at a lower level is the energy market is becoming individualized. And I would wonder if perhaps this is one of the reasons you think why there has been this slow movement away from the entrenched positions.
Yeah, it's an interesting point. It's yet to be the case that it'll be individualized, but yes, the direction is right. So the individualization of the energy market is that if you, a homeowner who used to first get electricity from the grid and paid somebody paid money to use that electricity, now suddenly have rooftop solar on your roof, you're not paying anybody you're paying the grid less money, even though the infrastructure, that is the cables and the maintenance, is still something that you need because you're not going to get solar power all the time. Yes, and so the transportation of that electricity, all of that infrastructure still has to be paid for. That is only in some places in the world. So California and some parts of Australia is where you're really feeling that, where not enough revenue is coming into the grid because people with rooftop solar are producing electricity. But most grids are nationalized or are run by monopolies, government-regulated monopolies. And so there is actually a way to ensure that they continue to get that support, but in the short term, it will mean that electricity will be more expensive till you can really reap the benefits of cheap electricity.
Now, there was a question just here. Thank you. Thanks very much.
Thank you. So you said that private capital has a role to play in making things better or working towards net zero. And do you have any views on how best that capital should be allocated? So, for instance, you mentioned the transformation from Dong into Ørsted, but is that really realistic for other oil majors? Or is private capital, for instance, better invested into the climate technology startups, for instance?
So different types of capital will do different types of things. One thing that has happened is in climate technologies, for example, the amount of venture capital, which is the sort of early stage risky capital going in, has really grown a lot because people are seeing that these startups can become the next Tesla and you can get a lot of return out of it. So there's more money flowing into it. So capital tends to go to places where you are able to see or at least forecast that you can make money. And climate technologies are getting the kinds of investments in that sense. Another way to think about capital is that there is a certain amount of investment we will have to make to meet these climate goals. And in developed countries, they're actually being made. So last year, about $2 trillion were put into the energy industry. $1 trillion were spent in rich countries on the right things. And $1 trillion was spent in developing countries, but not always on the right things. So what you need is private capital to find ways to go to developing countries to really make the transition happen. They're already sort of starting to do the stuff in developed countries. But the move to developing countries is very hard. There's political risks, there is currency risk, there is just higher interest rates. And so all of those things are currently what global leaders are working on. So in Paris in June, there's going to be a meeting that's going to look at a new global financial pact, trying to fix the global financial system so that more money can go to developing countries. But yeah, it's one that's it's a very messy picture right now from a financial perspective.
Now, one thing you haven't talked about is climate activism. How many people in the room have been on a march, a campaign, anything in favour of doing something about climate change? One, two,
A few hands,
four.
yeah.
Oh, quite a few. Yes, I think there are a good half dozen here. That's great. Would you like to talk about activism? Is there any point in going on these marches?
Yeah, I mean, is there, when you do go on a march, you know, do you see if it's had any impact? Is there anybody who feels like...
We got the public order bill instead.
Oh, wow. There you go. That is true. Here in the UK, climate activism is being actually strangled by the government. Yeah.
It's very naive.
You need a mic. Who's got it?
I'm going to be really naive because I'm really new to all of this, and this was really interesting, and I can see the value of it. But do you think we've missed something by we're winning the zero emission race because there's financial positivity in that companies are happy to do it. But we missed the biodiversity one. So do you think there is any way we could have monetized that as well?
Yeah, it's a good question. You know, there is a famous meme that is, it has a number of waves, tsunami-sized waves coming. Climate is a small one, and then behind it is biodiversity. And the numbers in biodiversity are stark and really terrible. So since 1970, there's been a 70% reduction in global biodiversity. That's just in the last 50 years, in 2 generations' time. And that is something that is 100% not being it's being adequately addressed. What is starting to change is that past December, there was what is being called the Paris Agreement for Biodiversity that was passed in Montreal. And we may start to see changes just like we did after Paris. So after Paris, people were sort of cynical, oh, it took you 25 years to come up with an agreement that's global, and it's so weak, and it's voluntary, and people won't do anything. What's the point? Well, it did change things. And there is a little bit of cynicism right now around the same sort of biodiversity goals that have been set up. But given that finally all the countries agree that one of the goals is to protect 30% of the planet by 2030, which is this decade. So they have a goal in a short term to do something about it. Whether you can make money off it, that is a much harder problem. And there are some small initiatives being developed here in the UK called biodiversity offsets. They seem greenwashy right now, but people are trying to experiment. That's how it'll work. You'll get experiments, which most will fail, and there might be one that succeeds. But it's very early days and 100% not being addressed as a problem.
You take the mic up there, please. Right up, and lady right at the back.
That lady.
You've been talking about how there's big worries about a national grid being unable to function efficiently in terms of generation of electricity. And so in this country, there's been a lot of campaigning for more localized and regionalized infrastructure because of the amount of electricity that's actually lost in cables when you actually try to reach somebody with the electricity that you have stored. How important do you think it is to really stress this point of localized and regionalized rather than nationalized infrastructure?
It's a good solution, and if more people can agree to it, the better. The trouble is there's something called NIMBYism, which is not in my backyard. And there are a lot of people who don't want to see a wind turbine from their house. And those people still are around. So you need to talk to them, you need to convince them. And this is not just for wind turbines, but also for electricity transmission, which you're going to need more of as you build out these more localized grids. But it is a political problem than it is a technology problem. And the case from a technology and cost perspective is that localized electricity will be good, but it's mostly a political problem that needs to be solved.
Question over here, please.
A lot of the press commentary, thank you. A lot of the press commentary is about the fact that we are in a race against time. And, you know, I get the impression that you're an optimist on solutions and so on. But are these solutions going to be put into practice in time for disaster to be averted? Because a lot of people say that when the pandemic happened, vaccines were developed in double quick time because there was the will to develop them. And as you say, the Indian government, for example, is dragging its feet on various things. So how much are we going to win this race against time, in your view, and how?
So one thing to remember is what we are doing now and will keep doing for decades is really limiting the damage. The planet is warmer than it's ever been. It's going to keep getting warm for a while. And the trouble is, limiting the damage is not a rallying cry people get behind. And so what you need to, from a ability of whether we'll solve this in time, we are actually already late, right? You don't want 1.2 degrees Celsius of warming. You don't want 1.5 degrees Celsius of warming. So some of this is baked in, and that's going to happen. What you're doing now is limiting the damage, but that limiting of damage is really important, because if you don't do it, then it'll be much, much worse coming down. And I mean, just from the projections of where we were heading and where we are heading, there is actually already progress. So before Paris Agreement was signed, the end century temperature warming would have been 4 degrees Celsius. That would have been disastrous. We're talking hundreds of millions of people migrating, entire parts of the planet becoming uninhabitable. We are now on a 2 degrees Celsius path, which is where the Paris Agreement wants it to be. And that's happened within this 6-7 year period, at least from a projection standpoint. So already there is enough momentum to try and tackle the problem. Whether we'll reach net zero by 2050, which is the goal this government has set, and many of the world's largest governments have set, not sure, right? We have technologies, we have policy, we'll need political will, but should we aim for it and not meet it, it'll still be a better effort than actually not doing anything. So that's the way to think about it, really. Thank you.
So, question down here.
Thank you. My question is on collective action, as you've mentioned, activism also. So in Western countries, we see, like in US and UK, there's a lot of focus from people seeing climate emergency as an imminent problem, and that essentially, I feel like, puts governments in a position to put it on their political agenda or priorities, and at the same time, private capital and companies. But that's not the case in India. That's not the case in developing countries, where poverty is still a big problem. And it is somehow I feel like has skipped the agenda here, when the threads of climate emergency having its impact on immigration from like our region of Africa, from like on the poverty, I feel can be still seen as quite clearly, but in countries in like India, like there's still more pertinent issues people are worried about. First question is, do you see that, do you think like, or like what are the ways people can be rallied behind it so that it gets on government agenda there in India? And the second is a more relaxed question, actually, is about your transition from being an engineer and a doctorate to becoming a writer. How did that happen? If you want to talk about that a little bit, that'd be really interesting to hear.
I think the first one, my motivation to write this book was exactly to try and address that problem, which is as much as current climate impacts are bad and they are hurting people, what's coming is going to be much worse. And what you will see is, you will for the first time start seeing progress metrics reverse. So hunger for the past 50 years had been falling, and then since 2019 it's kept on increasing. This is pre-pandemic. Life expectancy after COVID has fallen in many countries. The US is among the worst hit, but even here in the UK. But in general trends, life expectancy around the world, including developing countries, is growing. That can start reversing. Poverty has been on a reduction. Again, that's gone up in what's happened in the pandemic, but climate will make that worse. So those progress metrics are what I hope through these climate solutions we'll be able to stop from reversing. And actually, in fact, in developing countries, the case for climate action now is stronger than ever. It's just that there isn't enough political understanding of it. So there are days now where it's so hot that you cannot work outside in India. There are cases where there's an insurance firm providing insurance to women in Gujarat who, during heat waves, go out to work because they have to get daily wages, but the instruments are so hot that they get boils in their hands. So these are things that are happening now on the ground. And developing countries, and India especially, really needs to understand that it is starting to affect the poor people way worse, way more than it's going to affect people who can afford air conditioning. And so it's really a moment where the political gap is so big, and I think some of that is because of the information ecosystem, that these topics are not talked about as much. You can't be critical of the government in many parts of the world, not just in India, but also in other parts of the world, especially in developing countries. And that stops real information from getting to people and having the political change that you need. But it's no longer that you need to make the case scientifically or economically for climate action to happen in those places. Yeah, and on the lighter note, it's been fun. I mean, Frances, when I went to her and I said, I'd like to try journalism, she's like, no, you've got such great skills. You should not be a journalist. You should be, working on harder problems. Somehow, I thought, no, I want to do this. I feel like I found a subject where I'm able to make a difference. And it really helps to be able to have people trained in science in journalism. And there's many of them here in the UK. I was able to look at other PhDs who are in different places across the media landscape, mostly doing science, but increasingly in other parts. The Economist was a place where there were a lot of PhDs who went on to...
Very quiet about their PhDs.
That's true.
They couldn't be pucker journalists.
So it's been fun, and I hope more people can do it. There is a real demand for expertise in newsrooms, and more people should.
I have one last question I want to ask you. Is this thing on? No, I think I'm going to ask one last question, and then I think we're going to wind up. I've always thought that there must be ways in which individuals probably...
I think you need to hold it closer.
No, I think it's turned itself off. How's this? Do you hear me now? No, thank you. Okay, that's better. I've always thought that there are individuals who think that if they shoot something into the atmosphere, it will reduce and hold off climate change. What do you think the chances are of somebody trying to do that, and what will the result be?
So this is something called geoengineering, and basically, climate is a problem where sun's heat is being trapped by carbon dioxide and warming the planet. What you can do, and it's possible, in theory, is to inject particles into the upper atmosphere that would reflect sunlight and thus lower the amount of heat that's trapped on the planet, and thus keep the planet cooler for longer. There is a TV series called Extrapolations out on Apple TV right now, which has, I think it's episode 4 or 5, that's specifically looking at this exact scenario. And the amount of particles you need to inject, at least temporarily, if you want to show to the world that this can be done, is not a lot. Probably $1 billion or $2 billion. That means it's within the reach of most of the billionaires around the world to actually pull it off. The trouble is you're going to create immediate chaos when that happens, because that if you may remember from the sort of explosions that happened in volcanoes, where you had these sulfur particles being put, you had, famously the year without a summer, which caused droughts, and so there'll be actual weather chaos immediately created if somebody does it in a rogue way. And then you have to continue to keep that much amount of particles into the atmosphere to keep the planet at that temperature, which means after the first few $1 billion, you're going to need that many $1 billion every year for the next, I don't know, 100 years. And so if people are serious, and there should be research on this, it has to come to it through a global governance system where all countries agree on something. And if it took 25 years to reach the Paris Agreement, I'm not sure whether we'll have enough time to be able to do that for geoengineering.
Well, thank you very much indeed. I think this one is on. Thank you. This has been a terrific session. I hope all of you will go and buy the book. It's called
Climate Capitalism.
Climate Capitalism. And are there copies out there yet?
No, because it'll be out in October. So there's a little flyer out there
there's the flyer.
With a link.
Brandish it high.
If you
Pick up a copy.
QR code or put a URL, then you can go and pre-order it now.
And thank you for being a wonderful... What?
Well, let's see how this happens. It's been 4 years writing it, so there's a lot of time it takes to write a book. So if this does well, then maybe yes.
Thank you all very much. You've been a great audience.
Thank you very much, Akshat and Francis. And I can also highly recommend the podcast Zero. I'm a fan, massive fan. So please do listen into it. Our next item on the agenda is lunch. You'll be very happy to know we'd like to invite you all upstairs to it. Before you disappear, I'd just like to say, please be back in time at 2 p.m. for our next session with Amish Tripathi and Davis Bunn. Also, speaking of climate and sustainability and ecology has been a fundamental part of Khushwant Singh Literary Festival, and to date over 2,000 trees have been planted with each festival that takes place. So I think long live that contribution as well. And on that note, thank you, and please join us for some lunch upstairs.
Is that working?
That's perfect for me.
Okay, so let's see which one isn't working.
There was one of those two.
Hello.
Testing 1 2 1 2.
Hello. Yeah. Hello. Hello. Testing 1 2 3. Yeah. More. Okay. Testing 1 2 3 1 2 3 1 2 3. Testing 1 2 3. Hello? Yeah? Is it okay?
It's a bit high.
Hi, okay. Testing 1 2 3. 1 2 3. Yeah? Okay, thank you.
Much pain, but it was so, it had gone down